They saved her a seat in the front row, so they wouldn't miss the moment she broke. The chandelier lights spilled across polished marble as Evelyn Carter stepped into the ballroom, her heels soft against the floor, her name already printed in gold on a chair placed just a few feet from the altar, too close, intentionally close, like a spotlight no one admitted to turning on. And as conversations dimmed into whispers, heads turned not with curiosity but recognition, because everyone here knew who she was, or at least who she used to be, the woman Daniel Brooks had once promised. Forever to before choosing something shinier, something louder, something easier to display. And now he stood at the altar in a tailored tuxedo, smiling like a man who believed his past had been neatly erased, while beside him, the bride lifted a champagne glass and let out a light laugh that carried just far enough. "Some people are lessons," she said, her eyes drifting deliberately toward Evelyn. "And some people are upgrades." And the room responded exactly as expected, a ripple of polite laughter, a few sharper smiles, the kind that don't bother hiding what they mean. But Evelyn didn't react. Not when the words landed, not when the glances lingered, not even when Daniel finally looked at her. Just for a second, just long enough to confirm she had shown up alone, exactly as he had planned, because this wasn't an invitation, it was a performance, and she was meant to be the final act, the quiet proof that he had moved on to something better, yet something in her stillness didn't match the script, her posture too steady, her gaze too calm, as if the weight of the room couldn't quite reach her. And while the bride continued speaking, turning their history into a story shaped for applause, Evelyn's attention drifted elsewhere, not to the stage, not to the crowd, but to the far end of the room, where the tall doors remained closed, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of her seat as she lowered herself into it without hesitation, without apology, crossing her legs, with the ease of someone who didn't need permission to exist in that space. And for a brief moment, just a flicker, she glanced down at her watch, not nervously, not impatiently, just precisely, as if the evening wasn't unfolding around her, but according to her, and Daniel noticed it, that small, almost invisible movement, and frowned slightly, because it didn't fit the version of her he remembered, the one who would have lowered her eyes, who would have shrunk under the weight of this room. But she didn't shrink, she didn't look away. She simply sat there, composed, silent, present, like she knew something no one else did. And somewhere beneath the music, beneath the laughter, beneath the carefully arranged cruelty, a quiet shift began to form, subtle but undeniable, as if the night had taken a breath it hadn't yet released. The laughter did not fade right away. It lingered like a thin layer of perfume in the air, polite on the surface but sharp underneath, and Evelyn Carter sat still in the middle of it, her back straight against the chair with her name etched in gold, her hands resting lightly in her lap, as if she had been seated there 100 times before, as if nothing about this moment was unfamiliar or unwelcome. And across the room Daniel Brooks turned his attention back to the guests, slipping easily into the role he had built for himself, confident, admired, untouchable, the kind of man who believed that success could rewrite history. And for a while, it worked. People leaned in when he spoke, nodded at his stories, laughed at his rehearsed charm, and every now and then his eyes flickered back to Evelyn, quick, calculating, checking if the scene had landed the way he intended, if she had begun to crack under the weight of it. But each time he looked, he found the same thing, not tears, not embarrassment, just that quiet, unreadable calm. And it unsettled him more than he expected, because it did not match the version of her he had carried in his mind, the one who had stood in a small apartment months ago, holding a pen over divorce papers, her fingers trembling just slightly as she signed away a life she had once believed in. He remembered that moment clearly, the silence between them, the way she had looked at him like she was trying to understand something that no longer made sense, and how he had avoided her eyes, already halfway into a future he thought would be brighter, faster, more impressive. He had told himself it was the right decision, that love was not enough, that he needed more, and now here he was, surrounded by that more, the elegant venue, the influential guests, the bride who fit perfectly into the image he wanted to project. And yet something about Evelyn's presence refused to stay in the past where he had placed her. She was not smaller, not diminished, not erased. She was simply different, and that difference began to ripple outward, subtle but noticeable. A few guests shifting in their seats, a pause too long between sentences, the bride glancing toward Evelyn with a smile that did not quite hold, as if she too sensed that the script was slipping just slightly off course. And still, Evelyn said nothing. She did not defend herself, did not challenge a single word that had been thrown in her direction. Her silence was not empty. It was deliberate, filled with something steady and unshaken. And once again her gaze drifted toward the doors at the far end of the ballroom. Closed, quiet, almost forgotten by everyone else, but not by her, because beneath the polished surface of the evening, beneath the carefully arranged humiliation, there was a timing that only she seemed to understand. And as the music swelled gently and another toast was raised, Evelyn allowed herself the smallest breath, slow and measured, as if aligning herself with a moment that had not yet arrived, but was already certain. And somewhere deep in that certainty was a truth Daniel could not yet see, that this night was never meant to be the end of her story. It was only the point where everything began to turn. The music shifted into something softer, almost romantic, as if the room was trying to convince itself that everything was exactly as it should be. And for most people, it worked. Conversations resumed, glasses clinked, the illusion stitched itself back together with practiced ease. But not for Daniel Brooks, because the more the night progressed, the more aware he became of a quiet imbalance he could not explain. It was not loud, not obvious, but it was there, in the way a few guests kept glancing toward Evelyn Carter just a second longer than necessary, in the way the bride's laughter began to sound slightly forced, just a fraction too bright, and most of all, in the way Evelyn remained unchanged. She did not shrink into the background, did not leave early, did not play the role that had been so carefully designed for her. Instead, she existed in the space as if it belonged to her just as much as anyone else, her presence steady, unbothered, almost detached, like she was observing rather than enduring. And Daniel found himself watching her more than he intended, searching for a crack, a sign that the pressure was working. But there was nothing to find, only that same composed stillness. And then it happened again, subtle, nearly invisible. Evelyn glanced at her watch, not nervously, not impatiently, but with intention, like someone confirming a detail that had already been decided. And this time Daniel noticed it clearly, his smile faltering for just a moment before he quickly masked it, because something about that gesture unsettled him in a way he could not immediately justify. It was too precise, too deliberate, and it did not belong in the narrative he had built for tonight, because in his version, she was supposed to react, to feel, to break, not to wait. And yet she was waiting, not for approval, not for forgiveness, but for something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with him. And as that realization brushed against his thoughts, a faint tension began to tighten across the room, almost imperceptible but growing, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. The bride continued speaking, moving into another toast, her voice smooth but her eyes flickering briefly toward Evelyn, as if seeking confirmation that the balance of attention was still where it should be. But even she could feel it now, that something had changed, not dramatically, not yet, but enough to make the edges of the moment feel less controlled. And still, the doors at the far end of the ballroom remained closed, silent, holding whatever waited behind them just out of reach, while Evelyn sat perfectly still, her gaze no longer drifting but fixed, calm and certain. And for the first time that evening, it became clear that she was not enduring the night. She was measuring it, every second, every word, every glance, aligned against a point no one else could see. And in that quiet alignment was a truth that had not yet revealed itself, but was already powerful enough to begin unraveling everything Daniel believed he had secured. Because the night was not building toward his victory, it was moving, steadily and inevitably, towards something else entirely. There was a time when silence used to suffocate her, back when empty rooms felt louder than arguments and mornings arrived without direction. When Evelyn Carter would sit by the narrow window of a small apartment that barely held her past, and wonder how something that once felt so certain could disappear so completely. The world outside moving on without hesitation while she remained still, learning how to breathe in a life that no longer had a place for her. And in those early days she did not transform overnight. There was no sudden rise, no dramatic reinvention, only small, quiet choices. Waking up when the light touched the floor instead of hiding from it. Making coffee in a chipped mug that she never replaced because it reminded her that not everything broken needed to be thrown away. Taking on work that was not glamorous but honest. Building something piece by piece without needing anyone to notice, and slowly, almost invisibly, something shifted, not in her circumstances, but in her presence. She no longer waited for validation, no longer measured herself against what she had lost. She simply existed with a kind of calm that did not ask for permission, and it was during one of those ordinary afternoons, in a place that did not look important enough to change anything, that she met him, Alexander Hayes. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, no grand entrance, no immediate spark, just a quiet exchange over something simple, a conversation that did not try to impress, did not dig into her past, did not ask her to explain who she used to be, and that was what made it different, because he did not look at her like someone who needed to be understood or fixed. He looked at her like someone who was already complete, and over time his presence remained the same, steady, unintrusive, never demanding more than she was willing to give. He did not rush her, did not offer solutions she did not ask for. He simply created space, and in that space, she found something she had not realized she lost. Not love, not yet, but clarity. And when the invitation to the wedding arrived, folded neatly with her name, written in a script that felt too deliberate to be kind, she did not react the way she once might have. She did not hesitate, did not question whether she should go. She only looked at it for a moment before setting it down, her expression unchanged, and later, when she mentioned it to Alexander, there was no explanation attached, no emotional weight, just a simple statement, and he listened the same way he always did, without interruption, without judgment, and after a brief pause, he asked, only one thing, not why, not what it meant, but when, and she answered calmly, giving him the date and the time, and then, almost as an afterthought, she added that she would be attending, and he nodded, as if that was all he needed to know, as if the rest had already been decided somewhere beyond words. And now, sitting in that ballroom once again, with the past arranged carefully around her like a stage set, Evelyn did not feel the weight she once carried, because she was no longer standing in the same place. Even if the room looked familiar, even if the people had not changed, she had, and that difference, quiet and unspoken, was already enough to begin rewriting everything that was about to unfold. The memory of that quiet afternoon did not fade as the ballroom noise pressed in again. Instead, it settled beneath Evelyn Carter's composure like a steady foundation, and across the room, Daniel Brooks raised his glass once more, his voice carrying with practiced confidence as he spoke about success, about growth, about leaving behind what no longer served him, each word carefully chosen, each sentence designed to reinforce the image he had built, and the guests responded as expected, nodding, smiling, some even glancing toward Evelyn as if to measure the impact of his words against her silence. But she did not give them anything to measure, her expression unchanged, her posture relaxed, as if the speech was happening in a different room entirely. And yet Daniel could feel it now, a subtle resistance beneath the surface of the evening, something that did not align with the control he believed he had, because every time he tried to anchor the moment with another story, another joke, another reminder of how far he had come, the attention slipped, not dramatically, but just enough, drifting back toward the woman who was not participating, and that absence of reaction became its own presence, stronger than any response he could have forced from her. And near the edge of the room, a few conversations quieted as guests followed that same unspoken pull, their curiosity no longer about the celebration, but about the stillness that refused to break, and the bride noticed it too, her smile tightening ever so slightly as she reached for Daniel's hand, holding it a fraction longer than necessary, as if to reclaim the center of the room, to remind everyone where their focus belonged. But even that gesture felt less certain than before, because something had shifted in a way neither of them could fully explain. And then, without drawing attention, Evelyn moved, just enough to adjust her position, her gaze lifting once again toward the far end of the ballroom, toward the closed doors that had remained untouched throughout the evening. And there was no impatience in her expression, no anxiety, only a quiet certainty that made the moment feel almost suspended, as if time itself had slowed to match her rhythm. And Daniel saw it again, that glance, that calm awareness of something beyond the present scene, and this time it unsettled him more deeply, because it suggested that the evening was not unfolding under his control at all, that there was another timeline running beneath the one he had planned, one he could not see but could now begin to feel. And as the music softened and the final notes of his speech faded into polite applause, the room held a brief, fragile pause, the kind that usually passes unnoticed, but not tonight, because in that pause, something invisible began to align, and for the first time, Daniel felt the faint edge of uncertainty press against his confidence, a question forming without words, while Evelyn remained exactly as she had been from the moment she arrived, composed, silent, and waiting, not for recognition, not for redemption, but for a moment that was already on its way. And when it came, it would not ask for permission, it would simply arrive. The pause did not break, it stretched, thin and fragile, as if the entire room was balanced on something no one could quite name. And in that quiet space between applause and movement, Evelyn Carter lowered her gaze just slightly, not in submission, but in focus, her fingers brushing once more against the cool edge of her watch as if confirming what she already knew. And then she became completely still, not waiting in the way people wait when they are uncertain, but in the way someone waits when the outcome has already been decided. And across the room Daniel Brooks felt it, that invisible shift settling deeper into the atmosphere, the kind that made even familiar surroundings feel unfamiliar. He cleared his throat, offered another smile, attempted to guide the moment forward, but something in his voice no longer carried the same certainty. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet enough to create a hesitation in the room, a slight delay in responses, a glance exchanged between guests who could not explain why their attention kept drifting away from the stage. And then it happened, not with a sound at first, but with a change in presence, the kind that moves through a room before anyone consciously notices it. And one by one, conversations softened, heads turned, not toward Daniel, not toward the bride, but toward the far end of the ballroom where the tall doors, silent all evening, finally began to move, slowly, deliberately, as if the night itself had decided to open. And the shift was immediate, the kind that does not need explanation, because everyone feels it at the same time, the air tightening, the energy redirecting, and Daniel's expression faltered before he could stop it, his attention pulled instinctively in the same direction as everyone else, because he recognized that movement, that entrance, even before he fully saw it. And when the doors opened wide enough for the figure beyond them to step through, the reaction was not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Conversation stopped, glasses hovered midair, and the quiet that followed was no longer fragile. It was solid, undeniable, and standing in that doorway was Alexander Hayes, his presence composed, effortless, not demanding attention yet commanding it completely, dressed with the same understated precision that never needed to prove anything. And in that instant Daniel understood something he had not prepared for, because Alexander Hayes was not just another guest. He was the one person in the room whose opinion mattered beyond appearances, beyond speeches, beyond carefully constructed success, the man whose decisions shaped careers, whose approval could elevate or end opportunities without explanation. And yet Alexander did not look toward the altar, did not acknowledge the bride, did not respond to the subtle attempts of recognition from others. His focus moved through the room with quiet certainty until it found exactly what it was meant to find. And without hesitation, without pause, he began to walk forward, each step measured, unhurried, as if everything else in the room existed only as background to that single path. And Daniel felt it then, not fear, not yet, but the unmistakable collapse of control, because the moment he had orchestrated so carefully was no longer his. It had shifted entirely, and at the center of that shift, still seated, still composed, Evelyn Carter lifted her eyes to meet the approach, not surprised, not relieved, just aligned, as if this was always where the night had been leading. And for the first time, it became clear to everyone watching that she had never been the one on display. She had been the one waiting for the room to catch up. Alexander Hayes did not slow down as he moved through the room, and the quiet followed him, not out of obligation but recognition, the kind that settles in when. Presence alone carries weight, and with each step he took, the balance of the evening shifted further away from the stage that had been so carefully arranged, until even the music seemed to fade into something distant and irrelevant, and Daniel Brooks stood there, still holding the last trace of his speech in the air, watching as the one person he had hoped to impress, without question walked past every expectation he had built, not toward him, not toward the bride, but in a straight, unwavering line toward Evelyn Carter. And for a moment Daniel told himself it was coincidence, that there would be a turn, a pause, a redirection, something that would return control to where it belonged. But that moment never came, because Alexander did not hesitate, did not glance around, did not acknowledge the subtle attempts from others to capture his attention. His focus remained fixed, precise, as if the entire room had already been mapped and only one destination mattered. And when he finally reached her, he stopped, close enough that the distance between them felt intentional, not accidental, and the silence that followed was deeper than before, no longer uncertain but absolute. And Evelyn looked up at him with the same calm she had carried all evening. No surprise, no performance, just recognition, as if this was not an interruption, but a continuation. And then, without raising his voice, without needing to, Alexander spoke her name, simply and clearly, Evelyn. And in that single word there was no question, no hesitation, only familiarity, respect, something grounded and real that contrasted sharply with everything else in the room. And it landed with more force than any speech could have, because it revealed what no one had been told, that she was not here alone, that she had never been alone. And Daniel felt it then, the full weight of the shift, because this was not just his boss entering the room. This was his boss choosing a side without saying it out loud. And every instinct Daniel had built around control, around perception, around status, began to unravel quietly in that moment. While the bride stood frozen beside him, her expression caught between confusion and disbelief, watching as the attention she had held so tightly slipped away entirely. And around them the guests no longer pretended to focus on the ceremony, their eyes drawn completely to the quiet exchange unfolding just a few feet away, because something about it could not be ignored, not the stillness, not the contrast, not the undeniable shift in power that required no explanation. And Alexander extended his hand, not as a gesture meant to impress, but as something natural, expected, and Evelyn accepted it just as simply, rising from her seat with the same composed ease she had shown from the beginning. And in that motion, small and unspoken, everything changed, because she was no longer the woman placed there to be watched. She was the one being met, the one being acknowledged, the one the most powerful presence in the room had chosen to stand beside. And Daniel, for the first time that night, had nothing left to say. The moment Evelyn Carter stood beside Alexander Hayes, the room no longer belonged to Daniel Brooks. It shifted completely, not with noise, but with recognition, the kind that does not need to be announced because everyone feels it at once. And Daniel felt it most of all, standing at the altar where he had expected to remain the center of everything, now watching as the attention he had carefully built slipped through his hands without resistance, because Alexander did not acknowledge him, not even with a glance, and that absence said more than any confrontation ever could. It was not rejection, it was dismissal, quiet and absolute, and the guests understood it immediately, their posture changing, their expressions recalibrating, conversations no longer orbiting the ceremony, but redirecting toward the unspoken hierarchy that had just revealed itself. And the bride's smile faded into something uncertain, her grip tightening slightly around her bouquet as she looked between Daniel and the man who now stood beside the woman she had mocked only moments ago, unable to reconcile the difference between what she had expected and what was now unfolding. And Evelyn remained exactly as she had been, composed, unshaken, her presence not elevated by the moment but simply aligned with it, as if this was never about proving anything, only about standing where she truly belonged. And Alexander's voice, when he spoke again, was calm, measured, not loud but impossible to ignore, as he addressed the room with a brief acknowledgement that carried more authority than any speech given that night. And without unnecessary detail, without explanation. He made it clear that Evelyn was not an afterthought, not a past mistake, but someone of significance. Someone who stood beside him not by chance but by choice. And the meaning settled across the room like a quiet realization, because it was not just about who he was, it was about what he represented, the opportunities, the decisions, the future paths that everyone in that room, especially Daniel, had been trying to reach. And now that path stood directly beside the woman he had tried to erase, and Daniel's confidence, once effortless, now felt fragile, the edges of it dissolving under the weight of something he could not control or reverse. Because this was not a moment he could interrupt, not a narrative he could redirect. It was already complete, already decided, and all he could do was stand there and witness it. The shift of power, the collapse of assumption, the quiet, undeniable truth that the woman he had dismissed had not returned to reclaim anything from him. She had returned already beyond him. And as Evelyn turned slightly, her hand still resting in Alexander's, her gaze did not linger on Daniel, did not seek acknowledgement or closure. She simply moved forward, one step, then another, not away in retreat, but through the room with a calm that parted the space around her, and no one stopped her, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to question, only something to understand too late. The doors closed softly behind them, not with a sound that demanded attention, but with a finality that settled over the room long after Evelyn Carter and Alexander Hayes had stepped beyond it. And for a moment, no one moved, as if the space they left behind had not yet adjusted to their absence, and Daniel Brooks remained where he stood, the center of a stage that no longer held its meaning, his hand still loosely at his side, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and realization, because nothing had been taken from him in that moment. Nothing had been said, no accusation, no confrontation, and yet everything had changed. The certainty he had built, the narrative he had repeated, the belief that he had moved forward while she had been left behind. All of it had quietly unraveled without resistance. And across the room the guests began to shift, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the truth that had settled in, their attention no longer anchored to him. Their conversations no longer revolving around the celebration, because something more powerful than spectacle had just occurred, something that did not need explanation, and the bride lowered her gaze briefly, her confidence no longer as steady as it had been, her smile fading into something more measured, as if she too understood that what had just happened could not be undone or reframed. It could only be accepted, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing in not as humiliation, but as clarity, the kind that arrives too late to change anything, because for the first time, he saw it without distortion. Evelyn had not returned for him. She had not come to prove him wrong. She had not needed to. She had simply arrived as someone who no longer existed within the boundaries he had placed around her, and that was what he had failed to understand, that while he had been building a life measured by appearances, she had been building something quieter, something that did not rely on recognition, and now it stood beyond his reach, not because she had taken it away, but because she had outgrown the place he had left her in. And outside, beneath the soft glow of the evening lights, Evelyn walked without hesitation, her steps unhurried, her expression calm, not triumphant, not reflective, simply present, and beside her Alexander matched her pace. Without needing to lead, without needing to ask, the silence between them not empty, but complete, and as they moved away from the building, the noise of the celebration fading into the distance, there was no need for words, no need to revisit what had already passed, because nothing about that night had been about reclaiming the past. It had been about confirming something far more important, something she had already known long before she stepped into that room. And as she paused for just a brief moment, her gaze lifting toward the quiet horizon ahead, there was a softness in her expression that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with freedom, the kind that does not announce itself, does not demand to be seen. It simply exists, steady and undeniable, and without looking back, without a single word, she continued forward, leaving behind a story that no longer belonged to her, because she had not won him back. She had never needed to. She had already chosen herself, and that was the only victory